Okay, folks, we're going to restart our conference. I hope you've all had a chance to get some lunch. This session in the afternoon, we're going to focus on the impacts of climate change. And so it follows nicely from the discussion we had on the climate science, and in particular on the hazards and risks. So there's a nice transition from the meteorological side to the impacts of climate change. So we have a very distinguished panel today, Professor Melanie Austen from the University of Plymouth, Professor Jim Hall from the University of Oxford, Professor Jerry Knox from Cranfield University, and Dr. James Pearce-Higgins from the British Trust of Ornithology. I'm just going to say a few words setting a little bit of the background to climate impacts in the UK before I open it up. But I'll share with you the questions that we particularly wanted to discuss over the next hour that were posed to the panelists. So we're particularly interested in learning more about what climate impacts have already occurred in these different sectors, and we're covering, the marine and terrestrial environment, water and agriculture on this session, and then after the break we'll cover some more. We also want to know a little bit about what's the role of adaptation that's played up to now in dealing with risks, and in particular we'll focus on what are the expected impacts of climate change for higher degrees of global warming, beyond 3 degrees, for example. We'll also touch a little bit upon what kind of adaptation actions are expected, and are there some potential opportunities as well. And finally, we hopefully will distill also a little bit, as we did this morning, what are some of the key knowledge gaps and opportunities for further progress in research in this particular area. So just a little bit of background that I want to set the scene is that there are many, besides the scientific curiosity of better understanding climate change impact, there's actually a lot of other drivers now ongoing. And I've put a few pictures there from something that many of you have heard before, the climate change risk assessment. So its origins is from the Climate Change Act. But there's also other features. So the adaptation reporting power also requires organizations such as water companies, energy utilities to figure out what are the impacts of climate change and on their organization, and how will they adapt to climate change. And a result of those two is the National Adaptation Programme that the UK government implements every 5 years, a little bit like the climate change risk assessment. There's a cyclical nature to it. But I'd also highlight that there's many other drivers that have come on board over the last 5 years. So the Paris Agreement is a very important one, where actually adaptation is set out as a goal. So countries can, in their national determined contributions, their NDCs as it's known, actually include adaptation in it. So it'll be interesting to see how many countries do that over the next couple of years. There's TCFD, which we talked about in the earlier session, as well as mentioned, so voluntary aspects that are particularly prevalent in the finance sector. And then there's things like standards. There's now an international standard on adaptation. So a lot of this is driving the demand for more understanding of what are the climate impacts in the UK. And you can see in this plot here in the middle that the last climate change risk assessment, that was the second one. You'll hear from many of the talks that people are working on the third assessment report, sorry, the third version of the climate change risk assessment. On the second one, you can see how flooding, risks to health from high temperatures, and then water scarcity and other things are some of them are ranked the top risks for the country where more action is needed. And you can see how there's also a variety of research priorities that were identified last time around. That effectively fed into the Strategic Priorities Fund UK Climate Resilience Programme that I introduced earlier. So many of the speakers will talk to these topics, so I won't go into many of the details here, but obviously this is on the Committee on Climate Change website. I'll just highlight a couple of recent research in this area. So Nigel Arnell alluded to this a little bit earlier. So this is funded through this SPF program. Nigel from the University of Reading has been looking at indicators. So how do you translate the hazard information into potential support for risk assessment? So you can see here, just, there's a wealth of data behind this, but you can see how Nigel's used the UK climate projections to translate temperature into other indicators, for example, for transport, say, surface melt, for example, so temperatures above 33 degrees, for example, if we zoom into this particular plot. And you can see, for example, that at different levels, the risk becomes higher. So in green, you've got a 2 degrees pathway, in yellow, you've got a 3 degrees pathway, and in four, you've got in purple, you've got a 4 degree pathway. So you can see how the risk increases for that particular indicator. And you can see how those, there's a variety of indicators that have been produced, for example, particularly for the growing season, wildfire, and also stream flow. So you can see how, a lot of the discussion we had in the morning, how some of that information gets translated using impact models and other models to provide decision relevant information. More recently, for the Committee on Climate Change, there's been some commissioned research, for example, looking particularly at flood risks. So I'd highlight the work of Paul Sayers and colleagues who have looked at how will flood risk change under a 2 degree world and also under a 4 degree world. And you can see that there's almost a doubling from the present day here. Even under 2 degrees, we almost double the flood risk for the UK. So the number of population that's a flood risk, the areas, but this is assuming no additional adaptation. And this is a topic that I'm sure Robert Nichols will follow up tomorrow morning. One that Jim will pick up, I think, in a little while is around water resource. So this is another piece of commissioned research by the Committee on Climate Change that HR Wallingford did to look at the supply and demand of water resource. And you can see here, again, 2 degree world, a 4 degree world for the 30 years time, and then towards the end of the century. And you can see particularly that, these red and orange colors are showing deficits, and the greens are showing positive supply demand balance. And you can see how the Southeast in particular is expected to have some very large decreases in that supply demand balance. Without further ado, I will move on to our panelists. We've asked them to provide 5 minutes summary of their presentation, and in particular to try to touch upon some of the questions that we've posed around what are the impacts at high levels of global warming, and what kind of adaptation has happened up to now. So our first speaker is Melanie Austen. She's a professor of ocean and society at the University of Plymouth. She's got more than 20 years research in this area, particularly doing interdisciplinary research in the marine context, both in the UK, in the EU, and internationally. She's particularly done a lot of work on blue economy and the marine natural capital and ecosystem services as well. So I'll hand over to you, Mel, and I'll put your slide up now. So over to you, Mel.
Thank you, Suraj. Really pleased to be here talking about marine. Going to refer really to 3 different reports that have come out, plus a few personal opinions, I think, perhaps, or personal experience. The IPCC Special Report on Oceans and Cryosphere, SROC, the Royal Society Policy Brief on that, and the regularly produced Marine Climate Change Impacts report cards, with a very significant one in 2020. And some of the key messages are that we can already see that seas are warming, oxygen is being reduced, the oceans are becoming more acidic, and sea level rise is already affecting UK coasts and seas. This is a concern. It needs monitoring. There is some monitoring, probably not sufficient. We're also seeing impacts on different parts of the food web, on seabed dwelling species, particularly on plankton, which underpin the whole of the marine food web, fishes, birds, and mammals. When we get changes in warming of the seas, reduced oxygen, etc., these are what we would call multiple stressors, and we're worried that they could have fundamental and disruptive impacts on the structure and functioning of ecosystems. Yet at this moment, the implications are still really quite uncertain. Another key finding that's coming up at the moment is that the upper range for UK sea level rise is much higher than previous estimates. Sorry about that. Hopefully somebody else will take it. Yeah. It's much higher than previous estimates, implying that there's much greater risk of coastal flood. And this is going to compound the effects from tidal flooding and the extreme weather, extreme rainfall. So potentially exacerbated flood impacts. And a few key kind of scenarios and projections for the future, that sea level rise could be as much as 0.78 meters by 2100 in London, 0.58 meters in Belfast. So this is really quite significant. And I actually meant to start by telling you, and the sea level rise really kind of hits it for me. About 95% of UK exports and imports come by ship into the UK. So that's a lot of shipping, but it's also a lot of dependency. And when you start to think about infrastructure at the coast, that starts to raise a few questions about where are we going by 2100. Suraje, could I have the next slide, please? So there are a wide range of economically important industries that are being affected by climate change. We're already seeing impacts on food availability, operating windows for working at sea, movement of goods and infrastructure. Also coastal erosion and flooding. There are multiple risks to UK industries and to the coastal communities. And there are also risks to human health and well-being, just through the physical impacts through flooding, but also disease, changes in the safety of seafood, and changes in people's ability to undertake health and well-being activities such as tourism and recreation. So what I've painted is a pretty grim picture so far. Thinking about mitigation and adaptation, I sit on the Natural Capital Committee, and we're very keen that this should be done within a natural capital context, because there are plenty of natural capital co-benefits that can go with some of the mitigation and adaptation that can go on in the marine environment. I very much admire the ambition of increasing offshore renewable energy massively. But I think we need to be really strategic in our thinking of how this is going to happen, such that we don't end up affecting some of the things which actually do mitigate naturally against climate change. Our marine carbon reserves are huge. 55% of carbon is actually in, biogeochemically sort of cycled carbon is actually in the sea. We don't want to disrupt these things in a climate where things are already being disrupted enough. But there are also lots of co-benefits. So there are pictures here of mussel farms with associated biodiversity. That's the strings on the right-hand side. We're getting improved seagrass beds, coastal retreat. All of these will also enhance biodiversity, but also enhance many of the ecosystem services that take place. Aquaculture and certain types of fishing can take place with renewable energy developments, as can leisure and recreation. So there are potentially quite a few win-win-wins here. Just at that very quick sort of off the back of an envelope calculation, we can do better if we're more strategic about how we transform the marine environment to help deal with climate change. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mel. Next up, we've got Professor Jim Hall. Jim is a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineers and a professor of climate and environmental risks at the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford, and his research is particularly focused at risk analysis and decision-making under uncertainty for water resource systems. So, Jim, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Suraje, and thanks for the invitation to join you this afternoon. My presentation is online, which contains I'm not going to use any pictures now. I'll try to respond to the questions you set. Whenever I'm speaking to before we start talking what we said about the future, in particular, when it comes to associated with
sorry, Jim, we were having some real trouble listening. You're breaking up even without the video now. So I think maybe I'm going to ask Jerry to go next, and maybe you could disconnect and reconnect again, because we were having a lot of trouble hearing you. Apologies. Unless you want to try speaking now and we see if it's working. Okay, he's gone. He'll come back. Apologies for that, folks. So I think next we'll go to Jerry. Jerry will talk to us about building resilience to climate change risks in UK food production. Jerry is a professor of agricultural water management at Cranfield University and has got 27 years of international experience in this area on water resources and agriculture. So I'll hand over to you, Jerry, and share your slides.
Thank you, Suraje.
Great.
Okay, so what I'd like to do is just briefly reflect on a few of the key points from my my early recorded presentation. And the first point is really around recognizing that agriculture has plays a multifunctional role in the rural landscape, and we need to sort of think about agriculture beyond simply being a primary food production service, but also thinking about the regulating and the provisioning services that it provides, as well as the substantial employment and livelihood and economic contributions it makes to the rural economy. Many people tend to think of agriculture as being a fairly small sector, but it's now the largest manufacturing sector in the UK, and it employs around 3.5 million people. So we need, when we're thinking about climate risks, we need to think not only of its multifunctional role, but its importance to the national economy. Now, in terms of climate risks, we need to also remember that climate change in an agricultural context, we're not so interested in average climate change. The gradual change over time, out towards the end of the century is obviously critically important. But from an agricultural perspective, we're much more concerned about seasonal extremes and climate variability, and how they then translate into impacts both in rain-fed cropping systems, in irrigated production and livestock systems. So really, we need to be spending much more time worrying about how greater climate variability and climate extremes will manifest the impacts within the sector. Now, in terms of the climate risks, there tends to be a view that most of the impacts are negative, but I think for northern latitudes and particularly humid and temperate environments, the impacts on crop production are generally considered to be more positive, because we're not constrained by thermal degree stress or water availability. So there is an opportunity here for UK agriculture to benefit from a warming climate, but it is contingent on water and nutrient availability. And what I mean by that is that the benefits to be accrued from a changing climate will only happen if water isn't either in deficit or excess, because that then impacts on the ability for agriculture to benefit from nutrient uptake and or to mitigate the impacts of nutrient losses off farm. Now, when we think about moving forward and building resilience to a changing climate and thinking about the next 30 years. The agricultural sector is really quite similar to many other business sectors in terms of looking at the 3 R's. And we talk about robustness, recovery, and reorientation. And within those 3 R's, we can think about 4 main dimensions. And the first is really about reducing probability. And that's where we think about decoupling production from the risk. And this could, for example, be building embankments to reduce the likelihood of flood risk. But one of the issues around decoupling is that it then locks you into what we'd call high value, high risk systems, and it gives you less agility to then adapt as the climate changes in the future. The other adaptation could be increasing robustness to persist. And here we mean sort of building resilience to absorb short-term, high intensity, high probability risks. And here we're thinking about businesses that are building in redundancy, building in headroom, building in diversity into their business models to try and cope with short-term, high-intensity risks. Now, whilst that is good, it has very high opportunity costs, and it also has a problem in that it tends to trap businesses within systems that they then expand their business potential, and they tap into that climate sort of resilience that they're factored in, such that over time their vulnerability to climate change re-emerges. So they're, for example, building redundancy or headroom into a business by building extra storage. As businesses expand, they increase production and they start to erode away that climate resilience that they'd originally intended. The other dimension, of course, is advanced warning and building on the knowledge from improved weather forecasting skill. Now, this really is relevant for rapid onset extreme events such as floods, and there's a lot of progress in that area, but less so when we think about the slow onset creeping phenomena like droughts. Of course, there's a lot of work on weather forecasting in more arid and semi-arid environments, but less so for the UK. And then finally, thinking about what might be much more transformative shifts in agricultural systems and reorientating farming systems to make them much more resilient to future climate shocks. There tends to be a view that this is recognition of the failure of past production processes, but actually what we're trying to encourage this is a perspective that it's an opportunity to adapt and develop businesses and to capitalize on the climate opportunities going forward. Can I have the next slide, please, Suraje? And then just a brief final comment is that when we're trying to think about impacts and particularly building resilience to future climate uncertainty, future extremes, we need triggers for change. And I think 2018 was an exemplar, really, a stark reminder of how basically, you know, climate change and the impacts of a meteorological and then an agricultural drought propagated through the agricultural industry. And here's an example of a very large agricultural reservoir that was emptied on the largest lowland agricultural estate in the UK. In fact, both their reservoirs were emptied. And this just really highlighted some of the very real risks that businesses are facing in the short term, but also that storage was one of the most pushed adaptation responses for climate change. But even in a dry year such as 2018, they weren't sufficient to cope with the climate in that year. So I will finish there and just make one final comment that it's not just the climate we should be thinking about, but also the other radical uncertainties that are linked to agroeconomic and policy change that will really impact on agriculture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerry. We'll try now to connect to Jim again. So Jim from the University of Oxford, do you want to go, Jim?
Yeah, apologies for that. Hopefully the tech is going to work this time. Can you hear me now?
That's good, Jim.
Yes.
Very good. Okay. And in fact, what Jerry has just said has set the scene very well for what I want to go back to, which is around water resources and in particular droughts and water scarcity. Where I'd started was by having a look at what impacts have occurred already. And actually, if you squinted a time series of precipitation since the 1800s, you're not going to see much trend. You might see a trend in the October through to April, the winter series, ticking upwards slightly, but the summer precipitation, there's very little trend. What we do know is definitely going on is temperature is going up, and that is driving up aridity. So evapotranspiration is going up, and that is definitely contributing to water scarcity. But as we've heard already in this conference, when we're thinking about climate impacts, we need to think very carefully about the other changes that are going on. And the things which are really driving water scarcity now are population increase and the impact that's having on municipal water supplies, and the steps which are quite rightly being taken to restore water to the natural environment. So reductions in the licenses for water companies and indeed agricultural water users for the amount of water which they can take from rivers and groundwater. What do we expect in the future? Well, those temperature increases which are already driving up evapotranspiration and aridity will go up in future. We know that for sure. We're still uncertain, as we've heard already, in terms of the implications for precipitation, but I think we can expect more profound changes to precipitation than we've experienced so far, possibly changes to blocking patterns and feedback with soil moisture, which might make things more severe with respect to droughts and water scarcity. And if we enter into a 3 degrees world, as we've also heard already, we need to be paying attention to all of the other things which are going to be going on in that world, not only in this country, but around the world, in particular in relation to food systems. In most countries in the world, water is primarily used for food, about 70% of water withdrawals. The UK is an exception in that context. But I think all over the world, we will see pressure on water for food, and we will see more of that in this country as well. So how is adaptation responding to that? And how should we respond? And as is so often the case with adaptation, the answer is there's no silver bullets, you've got to do it all. And for water resources, what that means is action on the demand side and on the supply side. So on demand, I'm talking about demand management, so reducing per capita consumption, reducing use in industry, including agriculture and the power sector, and doing more about leakage. And then on the supply side, we're talking about ways in which we can store water, transfer water, reuse water, desalinate saline and brackish water. And the challenge of all of that is, well, how do we prioritize? How do we balance? The energy industry talks about the trilemma, the challenge of balancing security of supply, affordability for energy users, and the impacts on the environment. And that is exactly the problem which the water industry faces as well, navigating that trilemma, so providing secure supplies in a way which is affordable for water users and preserves and indeed restores and enhances the resilience of the aquatic environment. And so that boils down to a big challenge of how do we appraise options under uncertainty at a range of different scales. And one of the interesting things going on in the water industry in this country at the moment is a transition from just company scale and water resource zone scale water resources planning through to regional groups. So neighboring water companies are understanding how they interact with each other, how they can share water amongst each other, and then the creation of a national big picture, a national water framework, which is beginning to tell us, well, what is the risk to water supplies at a national scale? And in many ways, the water industry, if we look at adaptation, is an innovator and a leader. Things sometimes move a bit frustratingly slowly. There are things I've been arguing for, which apparently may be happening in the 2024 water resource management plans. But nonetheless, the water industry is innovating in terms of the way in which it's planning its adaptation. It is recognizing the importance of the demand side, and the Environment Agency and regulators and government have got that message as well. But of course, there are still some gaps. And the final question we were asked, if I have another minute or so, is around knowledge gaps. And as I hinted at the outset, there are still gaps in terms of the proper representation of extreme droughts, which is what we need to be planning for. What are the spatial characteristics of those droughts? What are the statistical characteristics in terms of frequency, severity, and duration? I look very carefully at model outputs for drought projections, and I have to say that none of them validate particularly well. We're still doing a lot of bias correction, so that is an issue. There's also an issue with the observations that we've got with the national hydrological picture, that in particular low flows, we don't have a commonly shared national data set of how much water is being abstracted, how much water is being left in rivers, how much water would be there if it were not for the abstraction. So the naturalized flows, we don't have a coherent national picture of that. And we've still got quite a lot to learn about the impacts of droughts for people and the economy. My own group have been doing some work on the potential macroeconomic impacts of droughts, and the National Infrastructure Commission did some very interesting work in looking at the scenarios for how much it might cost to cope with the most extreme droughts. And then the other big gap is around the resilience of the natural environment. We know that ecosystems, if they're in good condition, recover from shocks. Droughts are a natural phenomenon, but we also know that if they're under stress, they're degraded, they're not able to cope. So we need to get those ecosystems into better shape so that they are more resilient, and also they're more resilient for us in those drought conditions. But overall, there are science gaps here. But I think the water sector is a good example of the connection between research and practice, and that the things that we've been working on research are being taken up in practice to inform adaptation decision making. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for thoroughly answering the questions. We'll pick up some of these themes as well in the next session. Certainly, Andy Challinor will pick up the international food aspects of that. And actually, you talking about the resilience of the natural environment fits perfectly with our next panelist. So Dr. James Pearce-Higgins is Director of Science at the British Trust for Ornithology. And that's where he leads a team that's working on climate change, looking at the impacts of climate change, projections of the future, and also informing adaptation. So James, over to you.
Thanks very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. So I've been given the task to give a brief kind of overview of the impacts of climate change on terrestrial systems, and particularly, to start off, I just want to point people to evidence that's already out there in terms of the UK Climate Change Risk Assessment, LWEC report cards, particularly those on biodiversity, and also the 2017 report of the state of the UK's birds, which had a particular climate change focus. Those are all available on the internet and still provide good summaries of the state of evidence. So in response to the first question that we were given about evidence for impacts, I think my first key message for the conference is that the impacts of climate change on terrestrial ecosystems are really widespread, right across the landscape and across species, whether we're looking at changes in the abundance and distribution of alpine plants on the tops of mountains, to impacts on freshwater systems on the coast with increased risks and rates of saline intrusion, and in habitats in between. And looking at species, there's widespread evidence of those impacts. And here in particular in the UK, we're very fortunate to have good large-scale long-term data sets, particularly collected by citizen scientists, to help us have evidence that goes back to the 1960s or earlier. And this shows really strong signals of climate change and warming, for example, on the timing of biological events, particularly the advance in our springs, with the timing of tree leafing, bud burst, plants flowering, insect emergence, bird migration, and birds nesting, all advancing by several days per decade and clearly in response to warming. Looking at impacts on species populations and communities, there's again significant evidence for widespread impacts. We've seen increases in the abundance and rates of aphids flying aphids caught by Rothamsted suction traps, for example, and about 60% of those observed increases are consistent with what models would suggest should happen in response to changes in temperature and rainfall. And similarly, there's been large declines in large moth populations, particularly in southern Britain, and about 50% of that decline in those species too is consistent with what our models would expect the impacts of climate change to have been. And for other groups like birds, many for whom there have been lots of other pressures affecting their populations, such as land use change. Even for our birds, we see about 1/3 of species populations changing from one year to the next in response to changes in temperature and rainfall upon population growth. And through time, those have particularly resulted in increases in the abundance of many of our common and widespread species, our garden birds, which tend to do better when it's warmer in the winter and warmer in the summer, but perhaps more negatively affecting some of our cold adapted northern and upland bird species, some of our seabirds that Mel's already touched on, and also some of our long distance migrants, which spend the winter in Africa and therefore are vulnerable not just to changes here, but elsewhere. And the third kind of strand of evidence we see is significant polewards or northward shifts in the distribution of species in response to warming, which in many cases can be dramatic. For example, small skippers have shifted their distribution from Yorkshire in the 1970s right up to the Scottish borders 30 years later, a shift of about 150 kilometres. And we see similar magnitude changes in the distribution of nuthatches, a woodland bird that was just on the Scottish borders, on the edge of that border in the 1980s, and is now advanced well beyond the central belt to date. So lots of evidence of impacts on the natural system, which in turn affect habitats, natural capital, and the provision of ecosystem services. And then looking to the future, those impacts basically are projected to extend with increasing magnitude of climate change. Southerly distributed species are modelled to continue to expand their distributions northwards, but that will be more difficult for habitat specialists. And particularly our northern and cold adapted species are projected to decline and become particularly vulnerable to climate change. And there's evidence that it's particularly our species of conservation concern for various reasons, which are maybe some of the most vulnerable as well. But picking up some of the points from the morning session, there is really high uncertainty over these projections for individual species, hence the need for ongoing monitoring and evidence to reduce this through time. So how does this link through to adaptation? And in my presentation, I use the example of golden plovers, which are an upland bird species on the southern edge of their global range in the UK. And they're vulnerable to the negative effects of warming, which causes the surface layers of peat to dry out, which reduces the abundance of their invertebrate prey. They particularly feed on crane flies, and that has a negative impact on their breeding success and on population changes. This knowledge leads to a relatively straightforward adaptation response, which is to re-wet many of our upland areas, which have previously been drained for historical agricultural or forestry reasons. And indeed, this is part of a habitat restoration strategy implemented by many conservation organisations across the country. Not only that will benefit biodiversity, but also deliver multiple other benefits for climate change mitigation and also human adaptation in terms of water availability and so forth. So I think in the face of uncertainty, we need to follow a number of generic adaptation principles. And I think Mike Moorcroft will talk more about these tomorrow, but such as valuing our protected area network and seeking to extend that and the quality of that, for example. But also the example of our management of peatlands that I've just talked about shows that where we understand particular mechanisms by which climate change affects species and systems, we can implement specific interventions to address those. And currently involved in a review of evidence that suggests that it's those sorts of approaches which have the highest likelihood of success when we implement them. So finally, looking forward, I've got a couple of suggestions about what needs to improve. Firstly, I think we need a clear sense of where we're going. What does success look like, particularly in relation to the natural world? And secondly, we need to continue to build our evidence base about what works in a changing climate and to understand potential limits to that adaptive success. And this will require that effective monitoring that I've talked about and analysis to test the success of interventions using a variety of combined approaches: experimentation, earth observation, and also the large-scale and long-term citizen science that I've talked about. And from a UK context, it's particularly worth noting, I think, the value of JNCC's surveillance programs that supports NGOs like ourselves to run these citizen science programs. And I think to conclude on a positive note, there is a particular opportunity around these to engage people with the biodiversity and climate crises through citizen science. We've seen in response to COVID-19 a real appreciation of nature and the natural world, and we're already harnessing this through increasing our engagement with our long-term monitoring, which of course enables people not just to help provide useful scientific data, but also to grow in their understanding of what's happening in the environment, particularly around impacts such as the impacts of climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James, and thank you all of you for your interventions. I'd like to suggest to people to do pose your questions in the Q&A. I encourage you to do that. I'd actually like to start off with one question that we had right at the beginning of the conference, which was quite an interesting one. So Emma Howard Boyd was quoting a colleague, Salim Ul-Haq, from Bangladesh, who was arguing that just as we have net zero, we should have zero vulnerability as a target. I guess you could, one could discuss it as an adaptation target. And I guess I wanted to ask you, and so a colleague, Robert Nichols, who might be here, asked the question about is zero vulnerability possible or desirable? And so based on your sectors that you've been studying, I'd like to hear brief answers to that question of whether zero vulnerability is indeed possible or desirable. So Mel, do you want to go first?
Of course, it's desirable. I mean, nobody wants anybody to be vulnerable or more vulnerable than anybody else from a point of equity. Whether it's possible or not, I don't think it probably is. I think in any of the sort of adaptations that are taking place and any of the mitigation activity, there's just going to be trade-offs. And, when I think about it from the blue economy point of view, if marine renewables are a way of helping to address the issue and the problem, then the trade-offs are that we might not, from the wildlife perspective, get as many birds. There might be impacts on sea mammals, particularly dolphins and whales and things like that in the sea. Those are iconic species that are really important to people, and people really care about them and from their health and well-being point of view for recreation and leisure. But we do push the carbon down. At the same time, we might not have, we're reducing access to fishermen into those renewable energy areas, those offshore wind farms. So we're affecting their livelihoods. And that's why I think, we need to be kind of strategic about how can we enhance some of those things that we don't want to lose, or minimize the loss of things that we don't want to lose, but at the same time start to address our net zero targets. That's on a very localized basis, let alone if you start looking at small island states, which are so vulnerable to the sea level rise. And, a comment has gone in the questions, we seem to be looking particularly at UK here. And I think, some of us have taken that as the focus, but the offshore, the international elements of this have also, part of that trade-offs is where are we going to try and help and reduce those impacts, and who are we focusing on to reduce the vulnerabilities?
Okay, thank you. Jerry, do you want to go next briefly?
Yeah, thanks, Suraje. I was just making a few notes there. I think from an agricultural perspective, achieving zero vulnerability would be incredibly difficult, and for a few key reasons, in that a lot of agricultural businesses are working to relatively short to medium-term planning horizons, and with that means that many of the vulnerabilities they're trying to address are largely agroeconomic or sort of supply chain focused, and the longer-term risks linked to climate, they tend to it tends to be very hard to build that into short-term business planning. So whilst they're trying to de-risk their businesses from climate and water risks, those are on a short-term horizon. So some of the vulnerabilities linked to the much longer-term climate changes, they tend to be pushing away into the back. The other important point is that it's been mentioned that the UK food system is part of a global food supply system. Jim talked about this, and half our food is imported, and that's unlikely to change dramatically in the next few years. So whilst we can try to manage the risks and reduce the vulnerability within the UK food system components, it's very hard to try and eliminate or control the externalities that happen offshore, whether they're climate related or geopolitically or otherwise driven. So we have to be careful about trying to not necessarily over-engineer the system, but rather to manage the risks that we have control over, and to have a better understanding of the risks that we have less control over, but how they might impact on the food system.
Okay. Thank you, Jerry. Jim, do you want to have a go?
Yeah, very briefly. So I think we've agreed that zero vulnerability is not achievable. I'd say that it's neither is it desirable, because in order to achieve zero vulnerability, you are always foregoing things, foregoing opportunities and incurring costs in some sense. And one simply reaches a point where the costs exceed the benefits. If we think, for example, about planning and development in floodplains, which I think we would all agree that we should be preventing inappropriate development in floodplains. But there are parts of the country, parts of Lincolnshire, for example, where an entire local authority is in a floodplain. And so by trying to bring vulnerability to zero, you would be foregoing any development at all in that place. Even if the buildings were well protected or elevated on stilts, those people would still be vulnerable from the most extreme events. And is that really what we wish to inflict upon people? Not to mention the fact that for any extreme, there's always a small probability of an extreme which is even more severe. So whatever we design for, that design condition can always be exceeded. Just one word though, because the flip side to zero vulnerability might be an argument around so-called limits to adaptation. And I have to say, though, I don't think zero vulnerability makes sense. I'm also a limits to adaptation skeptic. There are many things which are cited, for example, adaptation in London on the Thames Estuary, which is right behind me here, where people have proposed there are limits of adaptation, which I don't actually think exist. And actually, I'm a skeptic about adaptation tipping points too. I think many of the adaptation situations we find ourselves in, because they're so variable in space and time, one gradually has to ramp up adaptation and tick things off in an order of preference, and you never actually encounter a tipping point. You might encounter that in some place, but across the country as a whole, we're gradually ramping up adaptation.
Thanks, Jim. James, do you want to have a quick go at this one?
Thanks. Yeah, I heard the question this morning. I think it's a really good kind of conceptual question to get us thinking. But actually, I think, and as I hope I kind of illustrated with with what I said, from a lot of species perspective, it's actually almost a combination between climate change and then human processes as well that determine the ultimate exposure of species to changes in the environment. So if you think about what I was saying in terms of the peatlands, it's a combination of sort of warmer summers, increasing evapotranspiration coupled with the drainage of those habitats, which is a human-induced pressure that leads to the impacts on those peatland systems. And I think it's particularly that interaction between climate change and other pressures which makes answering that question actually a really difficult one from a natural environment perspective, or even maybe you could duck it and say it's not really the right question to ask, because actually ultimately it's about sort of maintaining the integrity of our natural systems, avoiding species going onto lists of conservation concern, red list, being at risk of extinction, those sorts of ultimate objectives which I think are most important. And climate change is one of a number of threats, pressures that those species are facing, one that often exacerbates or increases the pressures from other causes, but certainly I think can't be treated in isolation.
Yeah, thank you very much for engaging in that provocative question. We now have quite a lot of questions for you folks, so I'm gonna select a couple. I'm probably gonna start with one from Peter Young here, which goes for both you, James, and Mel. How much do forward projections of UK native species take account of new diseases and invasive species? And how important is climate change to increasing these threats? I thought I'd ask you that because it's only in the CCRA2, it was highlighted as an area of further research needs. And so it'd be interesting to know if we've made progress there. Who would like to start? Go, James. Yeah.
So I think that was the right call from the previous CCRA, and I think the evidence is building. I mean, we're increasingly seeing impacts of diseases on wild birds, for example, having population level consequences, not necessarily with a climate change attribution, but there's a number of different causes there, and we do definitely see poleward shifts in the distribution and risks of different pathogens across Europe, and if they come to the UK, then they are potentially going to have negative impacts. And we're seeing that on some of our tree species, for example, already. So it's definitely one to watch. But I think again, it's probably the interaction between climate change and other human processes, such as the movement of goods and materials around the world, and how we manage those things, that will be as important as just the climate change impacts to date. So I think it continues to be an area that needs more research. We've published some work recently, for example, on impacts of ticks, but it's still one to watch. But I think it's difficult to say where specifically that disease risk lies relative to other elements of mechanisms of climate change impacts.
Would you like to add, Mel?
Yeah, I think from the marine perspective, yeah, there's increasing concern about particularly food species. So aquaculture species seem to be getting a greater prevalence of microbial disease, and I think nobody really knows quite how that's going to pan out or where it's going to go. Similarly, with harmful algal blooms, could be dangerous for people in terms of respiratory diseases or in terms of the shellfish industry or the safety of eating seafood. Again, sort of some signs, but with really low levels of certainty that climate change is beginning to increase pathogens like that. The other side of that question around invasive species is a really interesting one. I and others have been very excited to see bluefin tuna in Cornish waters recently. Now, it actually is a returning species, but there are plenty of others that are invasive species by a certain classification of invasive. And yet really they're just things that are just moving northwards as species are moving northwards out of UK waters and becoming more prevalent further north, then also some things are coming up into our waters. Are they invasive, or is it just a shift? And do we have to rethink what our concerns are about invasives? I mean, invasives are if they impact on the functioning of the marine environment, but at this stage, under climate change, with the changes in the food web, the plankton that underpins the food web, almost the invasive species, perhaps I'm just echoing what James said, seems to be a little bit of a less of a concern for me than what those fundamental changes are going to be to the food web that are induced by climate changes in the sea.
Okay, thank you, Mel. We've got a question from Hayley Fowler to you, Jim. Do you think we need to think about managing the impact of floods and droughts together in a more integrated approach? This could be the case for other potential impacts. But how do we do this? I guess, yeah, how can we manage, both too much water and too little water in an integrated way?
Yeah, I was actually just typing an answer to another question from Hayley, which was about how useful, if at all, climate models are for looking at future droughts. So let me just come back on that one, and then I'll talk about floods and droughts. I think I agree with Hayley in that given the biases and some of the mechanistic issues we understand, for example, with respect to blocking, that unfortunately climate models do not provide a particularly good guide for changing drought severity and frequency in the future, apart from what I said about temperature and evapotranspiration. But we can use models to generate large ensembles and synthetic droughts. We can use those to stress test our systems, and we can position those droughts statistically relative to the historic record. So at least we know where synthetic droughts stand compared to what we've seen in the past. That, of course, doesn't tell us much about what's going to happen in the future, but it enables us to test our systems. And by the way, I would say there should be more emphasis on ensemble size rather than on enhancing model resolution in our scenario exercises, because if we're going to test spatial temporal variability, we need much larger ensembles than we got, for example, from UKCP18. So then on to the floods and droughts question. Actually, I mean, it's kind of fashionable to say we should be dealing with floods and droughts at the same time. I'm not so sure, because the sets of responses are quite different. One might talk about storage, and in some parts of the world there are multi-purpose storage reservoirs, flood detention, and irrigation reservoirs, but often they don't perform particularly well. and there's hardly any of them in this country because of the nature of our river basins and our topography and so on. So I think actually there's a better case for focusing in a very portfolio way. So looking at all of the different things one can do to address floods and all of the different things you can do to address droughts.
Great, thank you. I've got one for you, Jerry, that you've already answered a little bit, but I'd like to expand it. You've typed the answer there, but Daniela Schmidt asked you about the soil qualities in the north to be able to expand crop production. But I guess I'd like to broaden this out, because in your intervention and in your talk, you have discussed opportunities. So this is a sector where there are opportunities under a changing climate. So I wonder if you could just characterize the balance between opportunities and risk briefly in the agricultural sector, as you see.
Okay. So yeah, I think I did mention that we need to be thinking more about the opportunities going forward, and I think certainly within agriculture there are many. You know, our climate is, from a crop production point of view, improving and giving opportunity to grow a wider range of crops, a more diverse range of crops, both food and non-food. But also it's bringing areas into production that may not have been suited either currently as we go forward. Some of our research a few years ago looked at how, for example, potato production might change by the 2050s, and with increased temperatures, changing rainfall regimes, there are large areas of the northeast and northern England that become much better suited to potato production. And so we have this this trade-off between increased aridity in the southeast, increased pressure on water resources, increased demand for water, but up in the north, an opportunity for expansion of production and crop diversification, so and less resource stress. So I think there's a clear opportunity. I think there's also an opportunity to think about how, you know, following our departure from the EU, how our agricultural systems might respond and adapt to markets. And there's plenty of opportunity for new cropping, for new markets to emerge post-Brexit. But that requires agroeconomic policy support and the right regulatory frameworks to support agriculture as a key sector. But I think the point about floods and droughts overarches this, that really we need to be connecting our understanding of drought impacts in agriculture with flooding. And we're starting to see that in initiatives such as Water Resources East and Water Resources Southeast, where agriculture needs to work with the environment, it needs to work with power generation and the public water supply sector to build resilience to both water shortage and water excess, so that we can scalp the floods and we can store the water to get us through the dry summers. So I think it's a combination of infrastructure, better management, being innovative about technology, and then also being brave about developing agriculture as a mainstream sector within the UK economy, rather than thinking of it as a small scale marginal activity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jerry, and thanks to all the panelists for the excellent discussion. We have ran out of time. We will essentially leave this session open, so if you are able to answer any of the questions by typing them, please do so. That would certainly be much appreciated. It's been a fascinating discussion. I think one topic that has been brought up that we'll pick up in the next session is around international risks and essentially transboundary risks and how they impact. Jim raised that, Jerry as well, and I think Mel, and also the questions have raised that. So certainly Andy Challinor will pick this up in the next session. So I think what I'll say now is thank you again. We will have a break of half an hour. So go and get your cup of tea, your coffee, your biscuits, and join us again in half an hour when Richard Betts from the Met Office and the University of Exeter will chair the next panel, which will focus on infrastructure, cities, impact on health, impacts on business and industry, and then the international dimensions that I mentioned. So thanks very much, and we'll see you back here in half an hour.
Right, hello everyone. It's time to start the next session. I'm Richard Betts. I'm Head of Climate Impacts Research at the Met Office Hadley Centre, and I'm also Chair of Climate Impacts at the University of Exeter. And I have the honour of chairing this part 2 of the Climate Impacts session this afternoon. So this follows on from the session that Suraje just chaired earlier on, addressing the same kind of questions, but with a second panel of expert speakers. And I'll bring those up to introduce. So the panel today, it's Ruth Wood from University of Manchester, Matthew Baylis from University of Liverpool, Swenja Surminski from LSE, and Challinor from University of Leeds. And Suraje already gave a very good introduction to our 2 sessions, so I won't say too much, but I just wanted to reflect on the fact that this is a very timely conference. There's an enormous amount happening around climate change and impact and adaptation at the moment. So we're in the middle of writing the 3rd UK climate change risk assessment. I'm technical lead on that. So I'm leading the writing of the technical chapters at the evidence report, working very closely with Catherine and others at the CCC. And in fact, all the speakers in this session now are involved in that. So Ruth, Swenja and Andy are chapter leads, and Matthew is a contributing author. So they're all doing a lot of work getting this ready to review in the next few weeks, actually. And then alongside that, of course, the IPCC 6th assessment report is also being prepared. So myself and several others in this conference are involved in that. And I just wanted to take the opportunity to plug the fact that the Working Group 2 report, the Impacts and Adaptation and Vulnerability report, will come out for review in a few weeks' time. So please, can members of this conference be ready to review that and bring your expertise to make it a strong report. So there's lots happening in the sort of science and policy world, but also outside of that, there's a huge amount of interest in civil society as well. So the Fridays for Future movement is still going. Young people are concerned about the climate that they'll see later on in their lives. Extinction Rebellion, of course, are very passionately expressing concern about what they see as the need for even more urgent action on climate change. And that brings me to the sort of to reflect on the questions we're addressing here. We're talking about climate change impacts in this session, and a lot of that has been about adaptation and resilience, quite rightly. But another important aspect of wanting to know about impacts of climate change is we want to know what it is we're trying to avoid. And you'll have seen in some of the talks for this session and the others that the potential impacts of very high levels of climate change. And it's not just that we're heading for perhaps around 3 degrees warming, as seems to be becoming the conventional wisdom. It's actually quite likely that we could see 4 degrees global warming within this century. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of that fact. So we should bear in mind these impacts are something which we're wishing to avoid, as well as something that we need to be considering we're going to adapt to. So that was all I wanted to say by way of introduction. So I think we will now move to the speakers, who will have 5 minutes each to give their verbal contributions in addition to the talks you've already seen. So the first speaker is Dr. Ruth Wood from the University of Manchester. So Ruth's a member of the Centre for Climate and Social Transformations, working on relationships between society and infrastructure and its effect on resource demand and resilience. He was a contributing author on the second CCRA, Climate Change Risk Assessment, and now, as I said, he's a lead author on the third one. So Ruth, over to you for your 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Richard. So these are some of the insights we've been drawing so far from the work we've been doing on the infrastructure. So thinking about what we know, we've gained a good understanding of how individual pieces of infrastructure respond to weather, and how in particular a 2 degree of warming affects performance. Most of these studies have tended to focus on the effects of one particular metric, either looking at the impacts of temperature on performance of a thermoelectric plant, or looking at flood risks to different types of infrastructure, or how wind speed affects outputs. And we've got an emerging understanding, but not a full understanding of how infrastructure networks respond to climate change. But we need to know more about at what point transformational change might be required to ensure reliability under a future climate. So what the big knowledge gaps are, so in particular, we need more studies which look at impacts beyond 2 degrees, and that incorporate sequences of weather events. So a drought followed by heavy rain or flood, to explore better the impacts on embankments and slope stability. And in general, a more holistic view of how infrastructure networks as a whole perform in future climates. So both covering changes in winter and summer across all forms of weather, not just temperature or flood risk, looking in the whole of how performance is affected. We know that wind speeds, for example, are a significant impact on infrastructure. And there's some extent a degree of uncertainty as to how wind speeds might change in the future. But I think there would be a benefit from a view on how to incorporate better the uncertainty around future wind speeds into climate impact studies, to avoid it becoming something which is just parked until better understanding of wind becomes available. Because actions could be taken now around new infrastructure in particular to better prepare it. There's also an increasing awareness of how interdependent infrastructure is. So for example, the interdependencies between the electricity network, transport systems, and ICT or digital infrastructure, and just how significant cascade failures can be if one element, electricity is lost, for example, has ramifications for our transport systems, our ICT systems, as well as the general impacts to consumers of loss of electricity. So we need a better understanding of the range of potential causes of these cascade failures, as well as joined up resilience strategies to protect against this. We also need to bring in a better consideration of how people, particularly those who are more vulnerable, are affected during these events, and ensure that the consideration of people and impacts on people is central when planning resilience strategies of the infrastructure operators. And one of the big gaps is also understanding of the vulnerability and exposure of ICT systems. There's not a lot of information publicly available on this, but its reliability and resilience is absolutely critical in underpinning transport, electricity, water supplies, etc., as well as society in general. So this summer I have developed a new dread, that of seeing the message, your internet connection is unstable, partway through a presentation or teaching. I never knew that would be an issue. So looking at opportunities for progress. So obviously infrastructure operators already have been reviewing risks to their own assets over the last 5 to 10 years or more, and implementing adaptation activities. But perhaps we need a better understanding of what levels of reliability infrastructure operators should be aiming to meet under what future climate. Is that a 1 in 100 or 1 in 500 year flood event under a 2, 3 or 4 degree future? And are these 1 in 100 year events the right type of metrics to be using to try and assess that? Around £640 billion of new infrastructure has been committed to in the last budget. And then there's an opportunity to ensure that that is future-proofed, and that there are mechanisms within the planning process to ensure that it is done. And we've set up new infrastructure that can be working reliably under whatever future climate may throw at it. But obviously there still remains a lot of existing infrastructure which all needs retrospectively assessing for climate risks and future proofing. through the use of potentially a form of adaptation pathways to do that. So there's progress has been made in adapting infrastructure to certainly our understanding of 2 degrees, but there is certainly still opportunities for better awareness of the impacts of beyond 2 degrees, and also how to take into account not only the interdependencies between infrastructures, but also how we better ensure that people are central to those resilience strategies. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ruth. So the next speaker is Matthew Baylis. So Matthew's Executive Dean of the Institute of Infection, Veterinary and Ecological Sciences at Liverpool University, and leads the Climate and Infectious Disease of Animals Research Group, and is deeply involved in infectious diseases on research on infectious diseases on animals and humans, including humans, particularly spread by insect vectors. So Matthew.
Yeah, thanks so much, and greetings everybody from lockdown in the Liverpool city region. My presentation is on the impacts of climate change on health and well-being. And I think we're all aware that climate and weather, affect our health in a myriad of different ways. And you can see examples of those on my first slide. But one way, perhaps one of the most important ways, is through the impact on infectious diseases. And certainly, if you didn't know the importance of infectious diseases before, I think we all do now. So a proportion of the infectious diseases that affect us are affected by climate and weather in different ways. And one of the jobs that my group has done is really to try to quantify that, looking at what proportion of diseases are affected by climate. And through a lengthy analysis that we did, we concluded that about 2/3 of all of the infectious diseases challenging us and animals are sensitive to climate in one way or another. And a proportion of those then we would expect to respond to climate change. Looking at those infectious diseases, the ones which have the highest level of climate sensitivity are those which are transmitted by vectors or in food or in water. And interestingly, a higher than expected proportion are zoonotic. So those are the ones that we catch from animals. Because of the importance of climate to vector-borne diseases, I'll quickly focus on them. Very often discussions in this area start with malaria as one of the biggest hitters in terms of infectious disease and vector-borne disease of people. In reality, I don't think that's a disease that we should be worrying about in the UK. The most lethal form has high thermal needs, and it's very unlikely that there would be any transmission in the UK. There are other forms, in fact, one with much lower thermal needs, which could be transmitted in the UK, and in fact, it used to be transmitted in the UK. The reality is that we had malaria in this country for many centuries. We already have a suitable climate for that form of malaria, so we don't need climate change to do anything there. But the reality is that through other changes in the way that we live, we drove that malaria out. And whatever climate change does, I don't see that malaria coming back in a sustained way. Where perhaps we should be concerned is over the viruses that mosquitoes and other vectors can transmit. So, for example, dengue fever, Zika, chikungunya, and others. And there's a number of reasons why we should be concerned. Very often there's no treatments for those diseases and maybe no vaccines, but also we are seeing those diseases spread, and we are seeing the vectors that transmit them spread. A couple of good examples, there's a disease called West Nile transmitted by mosquitoes, which is approaching the UK from the east, having been found in Germany and then in the Netherlands just last year. And a case posted today in Germany of a person hospitalized. And we have the mosquitoes that can transmit that disease. And then perhaps even more worrying is a vector called the Asian tiger mosquito, which is a subtropical species, but which has spread through Europe, and in the last few years has been found in southeast England. So we already have that species here, and that is one of the best vectors of dengue, Zika, and so on. So we have the vectors, or increasingly we're getting the vectors, but the modelling suggests that actually it'll be some time before the UK has a climate warm enough to support sustained transmission of some of these viral diseases. Possibly something like West Nile we might see in the shorter term, but some of these other ones I think would take considerably longer for that to happen. Much the same applies to animal diseases. There's viral diseases transmitted by vectors to animals. And the modelling that we've done there suggests that the size, the scale and the frequency of outbreaks caused by some of these diseases will increase with climate change as we move through this century. But an important conclusion of our modelling was that even though the risk will increase, our control measures that we have already to hand appear to be sufficient to deal with them right through to the end of the century. So hopefully we're okay there. Let me finish with a brief mention of pandemics, as that's on everyone's mind, and in particular of respiratory diseases. As we all know, these sort of diseases have a seasonal aspect, but actually the links to climate are very hard to find if they're there at all, let alone climate change. But there's one really important lesson, I think, which is that we need to stop or reduce disturbance of the natural environment so that the agents that cause these diseases stay in our wildlife and don't enter the human population. And in terms of reducing that disturbance of the natural environment, climate change and how we respond to climate change make an important contribution to that. So there's not many positives from COVID yet, but I think and I hope that one will be a changed view of our relationship with the natural environment. And I think it's really important that we include the effects of climate change in that discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Matthew. Next up is Dr. Swenja Surminski, who's head of adaptation research at the Grantham Research Institute, and Swenja is the chapter lead on the CCRA 3 chapter on business and industry. So Swenja.
Yeah, hello, and many thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure talking to you. So I would like to highlight a few key observations that come out of the CCRA work on business and industry, which I have to say is a real privilege because it allows me to talk to businesses up and down the country to explore their needs, their level of understanding of climate risk, and also their expectations in terms of government support. So, it's a real sort of exciting exercise to do this. And, to those listening who have been involved and have been providing support and evidence, many thanks. I mean, this is an ongoing process. So what I'm doing today is, give you a bit of insight in some of the aspects that we have observed. But maybe before I start, I just want to, just a note up front to say, obviously, we are doing this at a very strange time, and many businesses are right now dealing with the shock event that did not really feature in any of their risk scenarios or in their business continuity planning. So obviously the whole COVID situation, has thrown the sort of understanding of climate risk into a very different perspective. And, some businesses will survive, some won't, some have already collapsed, and, government support is key, as are government imposed restrictions. So, it's a very different world to do business in, and it exposes vulnerabilities and also showcases different coping strategies, including insurance, government support, downsizing. But something I notice is that I guess we probably all share that there's an assumption that we will go somewhere back to normal, back to what we've known, and we can carry on doing business as usual. And I think, there are many lessons to be learned for adaptation, but to me, that assumption that we will go back to normal is wrong, both in a COVID and also in terms of climate change. And I think that's kind of the key sort of point in discussions with businesses. So, where are we heading and what's the normal to prepare for? And, for businesses, the key questions are, what are the risks? When are they material for me, for my customers, my competitors, suppliers, and who will manage them? And, there is information out there, there are better tools, models, and they can help answer those questions. But very few companies, if you would ask them those questions, they would be able to give you a very clear answer to those now. And I think that's kind of the first observation, maybe the most important one, that although awareness and indeed the also direct experience of climate risk has increased, we're far from seeing a well-informed, evidence-based strategic response to climate risk. And why is this an issue? I mean, importantly, a large chunk of the adaptation action that we are discussing during this conference will depend on private sector action, delivery of adaptation action, financing of adaptation. And then there's also this systemic risk issue. Businesses taking action today, that will determine future risk level. And these are the so-called lock-ins. And understanding what needs to happen to avoid these, what incentives and information will be required. I guess that's kind of come out as the key focus area in our work for CCRA. So with CCRA, what we're basically doing is, we're conducting a stock take. So we're looking at the risks and the opportunities today and in the future. What's the knowledge, what has been assessed, where are the big gaps? And I guess it's not a big surprise to see flooding as the key risks impacting businesses and industries, as well as issues related to water scarcity and heat. As we are currently reviewing the urgency scoring and looking at trends across the UK and sectors, I won't really go into many details now, but just to flag sort of the biggest areas of concern, also in terms of lack of really understanding, are international risk through trade, supply chain, distribution networks, and then indirect impacts. So, as a business, you do not need to experience a changing climate to be impacted by it. And, this also includes dependencies and infrastructure and so on. So another key observation, there are real gaps in pulling together information about hazards. So, what is happening to flood, what is happening to heat, what is happening to water scarcity, exposure and vulnerability information. We're actually very far from a systematic assessment. And this applies across sectors and across business sizes, maybe with the exception of, infrastructure where a lot of progress has been made. But then the next observation is that most companies haven't even undertaken a current risk assessment, let alone looking at future risk assessment. So we've conducted a survey, and the large majority of companies that we talked to said they are concerned, but they haven't assessed the risk. And then there's also a lack of not being able to point to monetary impacts of climate risk. Even those companies who've been exposed to flood or have experienced, sort of a heat wave that impacted their production chain, they often really struggle coming up with a monetary number. And, I think this is kind of an interesting area to then explore how can we improve that understanding. A key point I would just like to flag there is, I think there's also a little bit of a, misunderstanding and, well, let's call it sort of fooling ourselves about understanding risk and challenges. There has been a big push in terms of risk data, analytic tools, particularly in the finance sector. We've seen actually a lot of consultancies also coming up with so ready-made assessment tools that can assist companies. And, I think there has been sort of a growing market for this. But what I noticed in my discussion is that, there is kind of a growing understanding that, well, we've kind of managed physical risk, we understand physical risk, and it's more of a longer term issue. So what we're concerned about is more immediate issues. We're concerned about our reputation, we're concerned about transition risk, reaching net zero. And there's very little effort to actually see how these risks are connected. And something I observed is that even sort of leaders in this field and industry experts, I sit down with them and ask them to basically do a CCRA assessment, looking at all the risks that we've identified and give us their verdict. And in many cases, apart from flooding, with regard to all the other risks, the answer was, well, you know, our tools are not robust enough. We don't know enough about vulnerability, and we haven't even factored in future climate change. And I think that's a really important message, because particularly when you are sort of looking at, you know, the finance sector and the disclosure requirements and regulatory efforts, you know, you could be excused for getting the impression that, you know, we are actually really getting on top of risk, and it's just a matter of time to then have adaptation strategies that flow from that. I think we are actually not really there. And yes, there are a few companies who are starting to also disclose and share their risk assessment. But, you know, I think particularly with physical risk, you know, we need to basically challenge ourselves also in terms of the understanding and also supporting companies. And if the larger corporates are actually struggling, what about SMEs? That's the next sort of key observation that's coming out, that, you know, regardless of the type of risk or the particular exposure or vulnerability that we've been exploring, SMEs are really, you know, well, in need of support, in need of advice. And this has come through particularly in discussions with, you know, the devolved administrations, sort of highlighting this as an area where actually government support is very important. So just to bring this to conclusion, I think, you know, it's sort of important to see this as a strategic, as a sort of investment issue for the business sector to then also play its part in adaptation. And I guess that's sort of where we actually want to go to, where then, you know, finance for adaptation is available. And this is also, you know, an important business opportunity in some sectors, but I think we're far from there yet. And yeah, watch this space as our chapter progresses. And yeah, next year we will have more information on this.
Thanks, Swenja. Cheers. And finally, Andy Challinor, who's Professor of Climate Impacts at the University of Leeds. He was a lead author on the IPCC AR5 chapter on food systems and a review editor on the Climate Change and Land Special Report last year, and is now co-leading the international chapter on CCRA3. So over to you, Andy.
Thanks very much, Rich. So the title of my the full talk that's available from the link is No Nation is an Island, the International Dimensions of Climate Change. So that's really what it's about, the risk cascades that come to us from abroad, and indeed cascade across sectors, very much related to what Swenja was just talking about. And I'm just going to make a few key points, all of which are kind of touch on a few key points, all of which you can go to the talk for more details. So impacts emerge from biophysical socioeconomic systems. They emerge from that whole set. My own background is on kind of climate impacts, mostly abroad. I've done some work, for example, looking at whether or not crop breeding across Africa for maize is keeping up with climate change. The answer is no, but the answer is no because of essentially the slowness of breeding and approval pipeline. So it's the socio-economic system that means that climate change is being outpaced. What if we think for the UK? I mean, here in the UK, it's extremes and variability that I think you can argue we're not keeping up with. So this issue also applies to the UK. And actually, this issue came out in an interesting way at the time of CCRA2, when the official government response to the chapter was produced, saying that they took a more optimistic view of the function of markets than the authors than we did. And this happened to come out at the time of, if you remember, I think it was the Beast from the East, which resulted in extremes in the south of Spain, in Murcia, where a lot of our salad, etc., comes from. And there were supply chain issues and some limits to availability of purchase of issues of salad in the UK. So there's clearly those international dimensions are already emerging through supply chains and have been emerging. So first key point, risks emerge when global biophysical socioeconomic systems are stressed in new ways. And climate isn't the only new way. It's the one we're talking about here. but it's the way in which it interacts with all the others that really causes the issue. So resilience is a key issue at the heart of this. Second key point that I think people can sometimes forget, climate is a global system that can apply global and coherent patterns of stress. We're not talking about a dreadful mess of uncertainty and we can only say so many things. I mean, yes, there are limits to what climate models can say and they're being continually developed, but there are some really nice analyses. I cite an example in the talk of Rossby waves enhancing the risk of concurrent heat waves in major breadbasket regions. That's an example, not my work, but there are other examples looking at processes across these systems, the biophysical, socioeconomic systems. So it's the way in which stresses evolve and the way in which our responses to those stresses evolve. Which leads to the third key point. Socio-political responses can actually amplify risk. Brief example, an export ban following a major crop failure has occurred in Russia in 2010. There are other examples. Sent a price signal to markets that meant that there was a spike in food prices. So the ways in which socio-political systems respond can amplify the kind of initial climate trigger, if you like to think of it that way. So the key message really is that we need to keep pace, not just with climate change, but with the evolution of these risk cascades, which act across sectors and borders and across many transmission pathways. So my very brief examples have been food related, because that's what I work on in the CCRA chapter, in both actually in 2017 and in the current one. We've looked at a range of transmission pathways, particularly the one we're working on at the moment, so energy, finance and markets, governance, IT and information, movement of goods, obviously movement of people. Well-being is a one that people are increasingly aware of in terms of just even a direct impact of climate change on people's well-being, but there are a whole host of others associated with health risks, of course. So just a few conclusions from that. The evidence for transmission of climate risks across sectors and borders has increased in the last sort of 7 years or so since CCRA2. There have been observed events such as the salad supply chain event I mentioned, more complex risk analysis, the breadbasket example, that give greater evidence for the reality of these risks now. There's also evidence of changes in geopolitics that favour the amplification of risk. Need I say COVID, EU exit, altering trade patterns and just-in-time supply chains, or, I believe what are people saying, broadly just as everything. There's also evidence of climate change acting as an amplifier of risk, a direct amplifier, such as violent conflict risk being amplified by climate events, either directly or via food. Now, whether that reaches the UK, this is an important point perhaps, it is a separate question. It may or may not, but certainly these stresses are happening globally. There's also evidence of major institutions which aren't famed for sensationalism. I'm thinking of the US Army, taking it very seriously, and there's a report I refer to in my talk on that. Last couple of conclusions. Well, I've said this already. We need to keep pace, not just with climate change, but with the way in which risk cascades evolve across both sectors and borders. This points very clearly to resilience, which in itself, I think, points clearly to the need for clear language and frameworks and methods to tackle these complex risk cascades. These terms get used in different ways, and we can all get into these academic whirlpools, but we need a clarity both internally and I think externally in communicating. One of my particular soapboxes is around the idea and the notion of integrated assessment frameworks in contrast to integrated assessment only models that are used to kind of answer these big questions. We need models, we need expertise, we need a whole range, but we need a framework that can bring those things together with as much objectivity as possible. And I think that's starting to happen now in the community. So that's all I wanted to bring so far to the discussion. Thanks very much to the organisers, by the way, for inviting me, and thank you, Rich.
Thanks, Andy. Right, so we'll move on to the questions. So I'll start with a few which have caught my eye, and then maybe Catherine might be able to jump in with others later on if we have time. But the first one I noticed, which was, I thought, a really good question from Richard Daniels to Ruth. Are you looking at the resilience of the new infrastructure that is needed to achieve net zero? I mean, that's a great question, because even if the UK implements net zero policies, what about the rest of the world? So Ruth, any thoughts on resilience of net zero infrastructure to climate change?
I think in terms of the CCRA, yes, we have looked at new forms of infrastructure which would be needed to deliver net zero. We've not gone into a huge amount of detail because partly the detailed risk assessments aren't in the public, aren't available, or haven't been done yet. But we have looked, for example, at if we are looking at increasing use of hydrogen, we need hydrogen production, or increased requirements for carbon capture and storage technology. For example, both of those need substantial amounts of water, and we've looked at what the implications are for the water requirements of those new technologies and how that changes the vulnerability of that sector to climate change. So we've done kind of a vulnerability assessment to see how these new technologies change vulnerability. They've not got them as much detailed assessments on them as existing infrastructure though. So there's more work in that area that could be done, but we've certainly tried to capture existing vulnerabilities that we know about.
Thanks, Ruth. And the next question I saw was from Roger Street, which is to Swenja. Do you believe that businesses and the broader financial community have the capacity and confidence to understand and assess their climate risks and adaptation proposals, such as they can confidently make decisions related to investments? On the adaptation side, assessing transitional adaptation is a particularly challenging area that will require investors' attention now. So Swenja, what do you think?
Well, the first point would be we need to distinguish between businesses, and I think particularly SMEs do not usually have the tools or the skills or actually the time to do this. So, but even with the larger corporates who've been looking at this, I think what they're missing is a good way of starting to incorporate adaptation action and having sort of reliable metrics that will allow them to factor in adaptation action. So if you look at, your counterparty, you're entering into a contract, you're assessing your suppliers, or you're making an investment, you want to understand if there is adaptation action happening and whether or not that is effective. At the moment, that is really difficult to assess, let alone to then factor into your decisions. So I think this should be a key area.
Thanks, Swenja. And there's a question directed at Matthew on health, but it's actually on heat rather than infectious diseases. It's from Rob Wilby. So Matthew, are you happy to answer the question on what should we be doing as a nation to adapt to extreme heat, especially in our major cities?
Yes, of course. It's clearly a really important area. I think we'll all be aware of the impacts of the heat waves in particular can have on human health, and high levels of excess mortality through various analyses when we or other countries have had such heat waves. It's clearly an important and growing issue, and the answer must be around how we build our houses. I'm really hoping that the answer is not a massive purchase of air conditioning units around UK cities, which would be sort of killing the patient in some ways. So hopefully we need to build for the future. When houses are built, they must have an expected lifetime of 50 to 100 years. So we really do need to be thinking ahead with materials that can insulate houses much more effectively. So I think really, in terms of new housing stock, clearly that's going to be in the building. Dealing with old housing stock will be much more challenging. But I guess over time, they will disappear and be replaced. But it's obviously an issue that we do need to take extremely seriously.
Great, thank you. And Jerry Knox has asked the question to Andy: how do we reconcile rising climate risks offshore and their impacts on livelihoods for smallholders against our growing demand for exotics and fresh produce coming from the most water and climate stressed part of the world?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. And I, for some reason, I did tick happy to answer this live, happy to have a go at this. I think because really the answer comes from, forgive me if this is sidestepping, but I don't think it is. The answer to that question comes from our capacity to look at whole systems. So whatever plan, whatever we may come up with here over these couple of days, for even if 400 or so people say, here's a way of doing this, actually, the answer to that question will emerge from the various food systems, supply chain systems, energy, all of the complex interactions in all of these systems. That's what gives us the answer to whether or not that happens. So we need to be looking at those systems, and we need to be looking clearly and holistically at those systems and kind of at all levels, which is a very difficult thing to do, very complex, but I think can have a simplicity at its heart if we just recall that actually climate change at its heart, I think, is a simple problem. And if we connect with that simplicity, we can get to that, to the complexity that's needed, but in order to answer the question. So I hope that wasn't too hand wavy, but I think we need a systemic approach, and a few people kind of agreeing a way forward won't actually result in that way forward, even if we do find a magic bullet, which probably doesn't exist. So.
Thanks, Andy. So Rowan Sutton's asked the question to Ruth, is there evidence of thresholds in the response of infrastructure above 2 degrees C global warming?
So the understanding we have of infrastructure's response at the moment, a lot of it is based on the design standards to which a wind turbine, a thermoelectric plant, a track, a road were built. So we know, for example, how those individual bits of infrastructure should respond to a given temperature. And what tends to happen is either at a certain point, the equipment cuts out, so it doesn't function anymore until temperature comes back down, or until wind blows a little less fast, or it performs less efficiently, or it might be that it ages more quickly, so you need to replace that asset every 20 years rather than every 50 years as you would have previously expected to. So above 2 degrees, you're kind of going increasingly, there'll be times when it's not operating at optimal performance as much, and that might go up as we go beyond 2 degrees. What we've not found is at things like at this degree of warming or at this level sea level rise, it becomes no longer economically viable for us still to be having a power plant on this side of the coast, or a railway track, a coastal railway track. So those thresholds have not found much on. So it's the big system changes. When does having a coastal railway line become economically inviable? So those types of thresholds we've not got as good an understanding on, partly because it's an economic decision as much as a practical decision. So that, not sure how well that answers the question.
Okay, no, yeah, that's helpful. Thanks, Ruth. So the question which has been most upvoted, as far as I can see, from Mike Rivington, which I think could go to any of the panel, what thresholds in climate-induced issues, people migration, flood damage, crop failure, etc., do we need to reach to trigger transformative changes in society, businesses, governance that will allow climate adaptation without conflict? Catherine's just flagged that one. Do you want to say something, Catherine, or does anyone else on the panel want to say anything?
No, I was just going to say this is a key thing that we're looking at for the next CCRA synthesis report. So very interested in the views of the panelists, but also if anyone wants to write in and give us views on this one, then feel free after the conference as well, as it's obviously a really difficult issue to evidence well. So yeah, very interested in it.
Thank you. Yeah, so any of the panel want to give some initial thoughts on this extremely difficult question? Swenja?
I can give a really good, this only because you said it's difficult, so now I'm allowed to give a not very good answer. I mean, let's not let it get to that, right? I mean, it's, I've just talked about kind of systems and joining up views and taking a joined up view of resilience. So it's a very hard question to answer, but also we could avoid it by asking how we might take a clearer look at the interaction of different systems and get those views into policy, which I think is happening actually to some extent. So.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I'd agree. Swenja.
Yes, I mean, I think from a business and industry sort of point of view, I guess what is happening at the moment, there are sort of pressure points, not necessarily in the terms of physical risk, although, for some physical risks such as flooding have also become quite a concern. But then in terms of, consumer pressure, investor pressure, disclosure requirements and so on, which is more aimed towards, what's happening in terms of net zero and how we're getting there. And I think, now the next level is to connect this and to actually have a more strategic view on how actually climate risks are also related to how successful we are and how successful businesses are, and that actually some of businesses sort of net zero strategies will also depend on managing climate risk well. And I think this slowly starting to begin to sort of starting to feature in some of the discussions at least. And one other point is, a big sort of omission, I think, from a sort of government point of view is the lack of consideration this in terms of industrial strategy. Because, we are kind of obviously thinking about the vision of, where the country is going, how, basically where employment is, what kind of industries are going to be where. And I think if you don't factor in climate risk into that, then, you can't really be strategic. And I think that's kind of, I would argue it's sort of a missed opportunity. And I think that would require some urgent adjustment so that it becomes part of that vision of how actually our business sector is going to look like in 20, 30, 40 years.
Thanks, Swenja. So I'm going to ask Catherine whether you'd seen any other questions you wanted to highlight.
There was one that actually got asked earlier by John Dora. I think John's actually had to leave the conference this afternoon, but I thought it was a really interesting one about the Sustainable Development Goals and the extent to which they are taken seriously or otherwise in the UK. And I wondered whether in your own personal experiences, you have any reflections on that in your own work. Because again, we're looking at adaptation in the CCC. We're looking at adaptation in terms of how can we meet our societal and environmental goals in the context of climate change? Are they still achievable? And the SDGs are very closely linked to that. So any reflections on that would be interesting.
I'll comment. Certainly, in terms of my work, then they've become very important because of I do a lot of work in Africa, and the funders have increasingly linked the work that we try to do with the SDGs. So they very much entered sort of academic life and the need to respond to those SDGs. Obviously, in an African setting, then many of them are very applicable. And we really try our hardest to pay attention to them and contribute to the solutions.
Thank you. Swenja.
Yeah, I guess, there is still this view that because of the development in its title, this only relates to, or mostly relates to developing countries and how we can support developing countries. And I think this is, in my view, that's a real misinterpretation, because the SDGs in terms of decisions being made here in a UK context are as relevant as elsewhere. So I think this is something that maybe going forward, this notion of sustainability and what it means and what are the different aspects that you consider when you make decisions here in social, environmental and economic terms. I think that's starting to begin with. We have just transition as a concept where you have social aspects suddenly featuring. So I think, that shift, it's not really only for developing, it's also very relevant for us here. I think that needs to happen.
Okay, thank you. So Mary Ekstrom asked a question which maybe even I can answer it actually, if I may. It said, given the different UK CP18 strands sample different pools of uncertainties, whose responsibility is it to bring together the different strands of UK CP18 to create local regional impact data sets? Others may want to jump in on this, but I think the CCRA process goes towards this in terms of synthesizing all the evidence from the literature on what different risks and impacts might be, and we are bringing in evidence that links to UK CP18 as much as we can. But also, I understand there's been a project funded under the UK Climate Resilience Programme, which I believe is designed to create a tool to integrate impacts. I don't know whether Suraje wants to comment on that, or any of the panel members want to step in on that. Maybe Suraje isn't there. But anyway, yeah, I think that the short answer to this important question is I think there's no clear responsibility as yet. So that's probably a kind of key gap in the sort of UK response about how to have a kind of integrated way of drawing together the projections into the sort of local impacts in a data form rather than the literature synthesis form.
Hi, Rich. I mean, I can jump in very briefly.
Sure.
There's, I mean, I think at the moment it is down to the users to figure out a little bit, you know, what is fit for purpose, which one of these products best characterizes risk, and then they utilize which one is better. So if you're, you know, if you're very interested in localized flooding, perhaps you go for the convective permitting model. And if you are interested in heat waves, you might go for some of the global models. But it is certainly, I think at the moment it's a question that's posed back to the user in terms of what to use. But I have been told by Jason Lowe, who we work with closely, that there's some add-on products that will be released, I think on Thursday, associated to UK CP18.
Yeah, they're an extreme weather, aren't they? I think which are coming out this week. That's great. Yeah. So Danny Schmidt has said we heard many questions, but they're mainly focused on mainland Europe. The UK has many international relationships with the overseas territories. Where does the panel see these transnational risks and the UK role in adaptation? I think Andy was going to volunteer to answer that.
Yeah, again, something of a partial answer. That I mean, supply chains are one kind of obvious issue. There are others. We look at these kind of in detail in the chapter. But one thing that emerges clearly is the sheer number of these possible risk pathways that could occur, that could be triggered by an event that can then subsequently have a cascade and amplification. The sheer number means that something is going to happen. So then it does become, I've said this before, it does become again about systemic resilience, which then tells us what, and forces to ask, what does the system look like? Which then, of course, the system is international, which then points very clearly to exactly that kind of cooperation and collaboration internationally in dealing with these systemic risks. So, you know, last time around we emphasized this point, and I think we'll be emphasizing it again this time, the tremendous importance of working and cooperating internationally towards systemic resilience.
Thanks, Andy. I see Nigel has responded to the previous question to say that the UK Climate Resilience Project, his project on this, as mentioned by Suraje, is calculating indicators with various UK CP18 products at different spatial scales, and he's happy to discuss that further online or offline. And there's been a few responses to the SDGs issue. Ted Shepherd thinks that it's been given the response to COVID has shown that the SDGs have a low priority in the UK, and Jerry Knox has asked what are the panel's views on the extent to which we're likely to fail meeting SDG 13 action on climate, which is about resilience as much as it is about mitigation. Does anyone have any views on SDG 13? Might be for Andy again. If you don't have a view, that's fine. Catherine might have a view.
I don't really, because actually the reason I was interested in the question is we hardly ever hear about the SDGs in the work we do, and we don't get a lot of push from either government or the private sector to consider the SDGs. There's been a little bit of, I guess, action to try and join up on things, but it doesn't, to us, seem to be a driver for policy across most of government. So I'd agree with Ted in what he said in his comment in return, that I think they're given a fairly low priority, which in some ways maybe is surprising. And I think other countries tend to put a lot more emphasis on them. And that, I think that relates as much to SDG 13 as it does to the others.
Okay, thank you. So Jim Paul has asked, picking up on the COVID-19 point, that what lessons should we be learning from our experience with the pandemic, particularly while the pandemic is such a live issue with the general public? And I think Matthew volunteered to answer that one.
Sure, yeah, I think there's a number of lessons. Obviously, at the moment, government is to a degree listening to scientists, perhaps as much as it ever has done. And it's a very good moment to follow up with the messaging. You know, Boris Johnson himself is looking to the future, because next year, when we have the chair of the G7, he's talking about, you know, long-term thoughts in terms of preventing the next pandemic and what steps need to be taken to do that with UK leadership. I believe that that climate change, both directly impacting on environments and how it impacts on us, and then we interact with environments, you know, is a part of that story, and that message needs to be taken through to government, you know, when we can. Another lesson, of course, is the need to act early. Infectious diseases make this more clear than perhaps in many other instances, that the earlier you respond, the less you have to do to bring something under control. And that certainly also obviously applies with climate change, but it's seen very clearly through the infectious disease, in the infectious disease world.
Okay, thank you. So we're getting close to the end of the session, maybe time for one or maybe two other questions. John Marsham has asked, the ongoing combinatorial crisis in East Africa, COVID, floods and locusts, conflict, migration, highlights how impacts of climate change and environmental change can combine in unforeseen ways. It's a long question written down, but the bottom line is, do you think we risk underestimating impacts of 3 degrees warming on global food supply chains? I think that's to Andy.
Thanks, Rich. Yeah, that was the question I was passing while you were trying to get something out of me on SDGs. My gut feeling here, John, everyone, is yes, but that's a gut feeling. So what does my subjective gut feeling mean? Perhaps something, but one might take the precautionary principle with this, and that would be important. Also important, as I emphasised in my talk, is the need for methods to look at this more objectively. But, you know, perhaps here the precautionary principle would take priority, and certainly my gut feeling is yes, things could be worse than we think. I'm not sure that being fearful particularly will help us in that endeavour, but anyway, there's a whole different little spiel that I won't go into on that, but hopefully that answers that question for now. Thanks, Rich.
Thanks, Andy. So yeah, so we're due to finish at 25 to us. I think it's probably time to wrap up. So I think that's been a really interesting discussion that really built well on the presentations that are online. I enjoyed seeing all the presentations. It was really good stuff there, and I think that's been good questions coming in as well. I think one of the key themes that's come out of this is probably the interrelated nature of everything, and the concept of risk cascades, and how international risks impact the UK in many ways, and several speakers have picked up on that. And I think one of the key phrases which will stay with me from Swenja actually was that we don't need to experience a climate change in itself to be impacted by it. We can be impacted by climate changes that others are experiencing as well, because the world is so interconnected. And I think that's a really good point, which kind of summarises the theme of this session. So it's now 25 to, so I think it's time for me to hand back to Suraje, but just to say thank you to all the speakers and to all the questions for a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich, very much for chairing this session, and thanks to all the panelists for the very interesting discussion. I've got the pleasure of just providing some concluding remarks for the day. I mean, I only have 5 minutes, so I'm not really able to summarize the richness of all the discussions. So I think I've boiled it down to a few observations that I'll share with you throughout the day. Starting with I guess the beginning, the first session we had on the climate science. I mean, I think it was very interesting to see the huge developments in climate science that we've had over the years. Particularly, for example, you know, observing how much climate change has already happened, for example, in the UK, but also that we still have some gaps around better estimation of extreme events, climate hazards, you know, droughts, floods, high precipitation, so on, but other things like better understanding of the dynamics as well, and also in particular how to bring together different types of evidence from models, from observations, and other alike. So I think that was quite interesting, and certainly an area that we'll have to work on more in the future. I think it was also particularly pleasing that a lot of colleagues talked about co-design and co-production, particularly in the context of working with other users. I think the insurance industry was mentioned there, but also the Environment Agency and other important actors that do need to adapt to changing climate. So, you know, there was a call for more funding to actually translate the research, and certainly, you know, a little bit of the UK Climate Resilience Programme does that, but there's a really big need to actually push the science forward here so that it becomes more usable and useful for decision makers needing to make these long-term planning decisions under a changing climate. In the afternoon, I mean, I was struck perhaps by the conversation on zero vulnerability. I mean, that was meant as slightly provocative, but it was quite interesting to see the spectrum, I guess, between that concept and limits to adaptation. So in effect, we've got, you know, quite a spectrum of responses as a society in the context of responding to climate risks. And in the afternoon, we saw, you know, that we're already observing a lot of these of climate impacts in many different spheres. It's very visible in biodiversity and the examples that James and Mel told us about earlier, but in many other fields as well, agriculture and other sectors as well. So the impacts of a changing climate are very visible, but you've got this spectrum, I guess, of then responses of adaptation. And I guess what struck me, and hopefully we'll pick this up tomorrow much more fully, is that ultimately it's about trade-offs. It's about trade-offs about things that we value. And so that will really determine where we are in that spectrum of sort of zero vulnerability up to there being some specific limits to adaptation. And obviously this will be different in different sectors, these trade-offs as well. But again, another thing I think that struck me, particularly in this last session, is then obviously the complexity of this problem. And I think, you know, Andy bringing in the international dimensions, not only do you have complexity just in the country between cross-cutting risks, you know, flooding, affecting infrastructure, affecting health and other things, but also then you've got the complexity of bringing the international risks happening on the other side of the planet and having an impact on the UK as well, so known as transnational risks or remote risks. So it's been fascinating and it's been really interesting. please join us tomorrow. We start at 10 a.m. We've got 2 keynote talks, one from Baroness Brown in the morning, and then another one from the Secretary of State, George Eustace, in the afternoon. And then we have a couple of sessions looking at adaptation to climate change, some of the limits, and also discussing the governance of climate change. So thanks again, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye.